Okay, so welcome to two old psychologists talking about stuff. Good morning, Ray.
Good morning, Rich, on this fine autumn morning.
This fine, overcast, slightly drizzly, typical English autumn morning.
Well, that's the full glory of the season, isn't it? Rather than just the chocolate box version of it.
Although I've moved house slightly toward the country, shall we say. I wear wellies every day, let's put it like that. And I am being treated to an absolute kind of glorious autumn in the sense of looking out my window to some trees and a hill and just a complete explosion of colour that's slightly different every day. So I found I've got a newfound love for autumn.
It'd be fascinating to have this conversation this time next year, won't it? And see if you're able to notice it as much, or whether there's a real sort of like novelty element. I mean, it may well be that you do, but you know, let's bookmark this and
I like the way you're trying to ruin it for me already. I've literally been here a few weeks, and you're trying to say this wonderful thing. That's not going to last.
Yeah,
that'll
it's just
fade.
wallpaper. It's just wallpaper, Rich. There'll be noise in the background. I happen not to believe that to be true, but you know, let's test it out.
Well, let's see. So, what's been occupying your headspace over the last few weeks?
On listening back to our previous podcasts, to just, you know, sort of like as we both do, just to sort of check them before they go out, you know, I have noticed the pattern that you commented on, which is often in the noticing things. I see something very positive, and then you're kind of grumpy about something. So I thought, well, it's probably my turn to be grumpy about something. The thing I've really noticed. I've had to sort of travel for work and organise various things. And in this modern world, lots of things are more convenient. Online booking of things tends to be very convenient. But the thing that's really pressed itself into my awareness is the constant demand for feedback from even the most trivial service that you engage with. It's sort of insatiable demand for rating, for evaluation, for comments. How have we done? Sometimes so rapidly that you haven't even used the service in question. All you've done is booked the service. And suddenly it's, how do we do? How did our website do? How did you find the interaction? At one level, I'm kind of happy to contribute to that because, you know, booking a hotel or a restaurant or something, I will look at reviews, you know, not be bound by them, but take a steer. But it's absolutely everything. And I also know that it's because that it's basically free for these guys, because you've had to sign up in order to get the information you actually need. You know, it's basically free for them to spray this stuff out. If they were paying £1, whatever it is for a stamp now, to send you a letter to ask you to fill it in and a stamped address envelope coming back, I don't think we'd be getting as many of them. Yeah, that's the thing I've really noticed, particularly in the last week or so.
I see your grumpiness, and I'll raise you.
Ooh.
With that, I mean, that is the kind of thing. This relates to what we talked about last time, like my button pressing around big organisations. That sort of stuff drives me nuts as well. I'm with you on that. I want to embrace your grumpiness.
Somewhere buried in a submenu of a submenu, there's an opt-out. It's that you don't have to do it, but the amount of time you'd have to invest in that. And the other thing is, very often, sneakily, some of these things are things where you want to be able to be alerted. Your flight has been changed. Your flight has been cancelled. There's roadworks allow an extra hour. And so what they're basically selling is, allow us to contact you, then we can give you this really important information. And then actually what happens is feedback surveys, you know, promoting other services. So maybe I need to embrace more grumpiness in myself.
Embrace the suck, as they say. Well, I'm going to do the old switcheroo on you then as well, if you're going to talk about something a bit grumpy. So I, last night, went to see Richard Dawkins speaking on his final book tour. So the guy is like 83 or something now, and he's decided to call time on his public speaking. And so he's just released a book, The Genetic Book of the Dead, and he was doing a book tour to promote it, being interviewed on stage and a Q&A with the audience. So I've been to those kinds of events before. There was just something very kind of special about it, just because it's the last one. And he's somebody who I would consider to be a hero of mine, I think. So yeah, I noticed that. What a tremendous talent for someone who sparks a lot of controversy because he's just very forthright in his opinion. A very humble guy as well. Very sharp, very bright. If I am anything like as bright as that at that age, I will be very pleased indeed. You know, if people would care to mention me in the same breath as the, you know, one of the great Richards, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Burton,
Yeah.
Dawkins, Gervais, Bennett. That would be a wonderful thing. I think it's not going to happen, though, right? I think it's not going to happen. But yeah, I think I wanted to just mention that today as a way of
Yeah.
publicly saying what a cool guy.
And what do you think it was about that format? Because, we can appreciate his words. There's plenty of video, and I too have been lucky enough to go and see him a couple of times live on previous sort of book tours. What do you think it is about the format of being there, being live, him talking about this, him being interviewed, that sort of brought it alive for you?
It's sort of seeing firsthand the encyclopedic knowledge. Like his head is just like it's a Haynes manual of biology. His ability to just respond in an incredibly erudite way to anything he's asked is something to behold. So they were talking last night. I mean, it was very biological, and I don't think my gateway into his work was, I think, more around sort of philosophical writing, some of his stuff around religion, and not so much the hardcore evolutionary biology, although I do find that very interesting. They were talking about mind parasites. So the guy that was interviewing him was an expert in mind parasites. And so he mentioned a bit of his work. And then Dawkins was just able to kind of access this incredible body of knowledge about mind parasites, which it's not his field, right? But he just knows stuff about that. They were I mean, as an aside, this just blew my mind. They were talking about a single cell parasitic organism that invades the brains of male mice. And what it does when it gets there is it makes them sexually attracted to cats. So when
Cats.
to cats, yeah. So it makes them attracted to predator. And the reason it does that is because when they smell cat urine, rather than kind of running away, they run towards, because they are now attracted to that scent. So they get eaten by the cat because the organism can only reproduce itself inside a cat. I mean,
Wow.
isn't nature amazing?
Wow. And that's all done without intentionality, isn't it? We assume, there's not a conscious decision-making process within that single-celled parasite. And the processes of evolution over unthinkable periods of time have shaped such a niche. That is remarkable. And of course, he's the guy who coined the word meme, isn't he? He created the concept of a meme. So it's just this broad range from the very biological to the, as you say, philosophical and sociological.
And like you say, it's had an enormous impact on culture in ways that many people wouldn't even know.
Yeah.
So yeah, quite a talent. Anyway, we should probably press on. So this is the kind of last episode where we are running through the title of our podcast. So this is us kind of laying out our mission statement, I suppose. And so the last word is stuff. So my starting point for thinking about stuff, it reminded me of what I often say on day one of the therapy training that I run. So can't remember whether I've mentioned this, but I have a job at the University of Birmingham where I train the next generation of CBT therapists, so the people that go on to work in NHS talking therapies. And so CBT 101, where we would start, that's cognitive behavioural therapy for anyone that's not in the biz, is to talk about just a basic model. So the way in which cognitive behavioral therapy sees the world. And so I usually say something like, at a very basic level, stuff happens. So events, whether they are external in the world or they are internal, such as thoughts or a physiological sensation, we think things about that stuff. And then whatever we think influences how we feel and behave. So that's kind of a basic cognitive ABC model that was, I guess, originated by Albert Ellis back in the 1950s. So A being activating event, B being belief, and C being consequence. So stuff happens, we have thoughts and beliefs about the stuff, and the thoughts and beliefs are really what influences how we feel and behave. Now, I remember, I am name dropping. I can't say I'm not name dropping and then name drop, but I'm name dropping. I remember being at a dinner table once with Professor Stephen Hayes, one of the originators of acceptance and commitment therapy, and he was very humble and polite too. He and I started talking about various versions of CBT, and I mentioned that I'd done a lot of training at the Albert Ellis Institute in New York, and I was very influenced by Ellis and that basic model. And I was expecting him to come up with all sorts of expansions or resistance to it because he has his own model. But actually, he surprised me, and he said, well, everyone can get behind that, right? Every different flavor of CBT therapist can get behind that basic idea that stuff happens. We think things about that stuff, and what we think is what influences how we feel and then how we behave.
Absolutely, yeah. And again, sort of, we can trace that back, can't we, through history to, the Stoic philosophers. And you're going to be able to correct me on this because I can't remember whether it was Epictetus or Marcus Aurelius who said people do not react to events but to the view they take of those events.
I believe that's Epictetus, but I may be wrong. Let's say it's Epictetus. You can write in and complain if we've got that wrong. Yeah, so it has a long history, and I think Stoic philosophy, even Buddhism, Lao Tse, and there's kind of a history there of a similar kind of idea. So we're on board with that. If this is our starting point for talking about stuff, you're happy with that. There's nothing you don't want to throw tomatoes.
No. I think that orients us to stuff in the world and thinking how that stuff may shape what we do, which is kind of very much our trade as psychologists.
So if we were to think of a consequence that perhaps brings people into the therapy room, let's say an emotional experience they don't like, anxiety, for example, or they're noticing a pattern of behavior that they wish they could change. If we kind of track that back, that's the consequence. There are beliefs and thoughts that will evoke that consequence. But then there will also be events that evoke those thoughts and beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yep.
So there's some stuff at the start of all of this. So what we might see is a person presenting with anxiety, and there is going to be some kind of stimulus at the start of that chain. So maybe we should unpack a little what that might be. And when we're thinking about the stuff that starts all this off, what is it that we're talking about?
And again, it kind of depends, I suppose, what we're actually interested in. You've named anxiety. So I guess there's certain kinds of stuff that is more likely to end up provoking anxiety type responses than other kinds of stuff. Angry snarling dog is an example of stuff that might well lead to anxiety, whereas pretty beautiful flower, less likely to lead to anxiety, unless we know that somebody has catastrophically bad allergic responses to things. And this particular flower they know is going to make them ill for days. It's not entirely a property of the stuff, of the stimulus out there. It really interacts with this individual.
Yeah, that is where this very simple kind of ABC idea starts to become very complex once you start to look at it, because the same stuff does not mean the same thing to different people, and it also doesn't mean the same thing to the same person on different days. So you can't really divorce stuff from the context that's wrapped around it, and that might be the actual physical context, like place that the event happens. For example, if somebody takes all of their clothes off in front of me, if that person's my partner, that's different to if it's someone I'm noticing Tesco when I'm shopping. Like it's the same kind of stimulus, but what it evokes is going to be very different depending on the context. If I could use an example that sort of relates to us personally. So you and I went to see Blade Runner recently.
Yeah.
And it wasn't
with
just
live
any
musical
old
accompaniment.
Right. It wasn't just any old Blade Runner. It was Blade Runner with a symphony orchestra attached. I was just reflecting the other day that I think I've seen Blade Runner 4 times in my life. It's one of my favourite films, but I wouldn't choose to watch it very often, even though I really, really do appreciate it. Now, twice of those times have been with you. You and Blade Runner are inextricably linked. So there we were. Anyway, we were at this performance of Blade Runner. We were there with our respective partners. I don't know what certificate Blade Runner is. Is it an 18?
No, don't think so. 15 maybe?
Anyway, it has a little bit of kind of violence and gore in it. So there's one particular scene, which I won't go into, but there's a violent scene in it. And I remember watching that. I was sat next to your partner, and I watched this scene, and it didn't really have any particular impact on me. It was gruesome, but I've seen lots of gruesome depictions of violence over the years, and it didn't really impact me. Your partner, I noticed, kind of had her head in her hands almost, covering her eyes like this was a really aversive stimulus. So I guess that's an example, right? It's the same thing. It's a visual depiction of a violent act. And then
Mm.
there are two people responding very differently to the same thing. So how is that possible?
The most obvious and simplest thing to say, I guess, is, well, different people are different, but that's just a restatement of the same thing. How do people come to react that differently, particularly when that's a consistent response? I know my wife doesn't particularly like violent films, so why did I drag her along to one? Well, actually, when we discussed, should we go along and see this movie? I really fancy going with our friends. Actually, a part of it was a couple of violent moments in it. You okay with that? Do you not want to do it? Or do you want to just give you a little nudge when a horrible moment's coming up? We're seeing that within a pattern of, it's not a one-off response. It's a kind of class of responses to equivalent things happening. And that's in a situation where all four of us, being adult, understanding people, realize we are not actually in the presence of one party in the film doing something horrific to another party in the film, because we know that we are sitting in a cinema and we're watching pixels flickering on a big screen. And yet the thing which it represents evokes these different responses of orientation and interest in your case, and very temporary kind of avoidance in my wife's case. Going back to your question of how do we get to that point? It's one of the big questions of psychology, isn't it? And I guess that's where the age-old nature-nurture debate comes in, is to what extent is a certain kind of response in situations like that actually there from the start, kind of wired, biological? To what extent is it a reflection of what you and I would call our learning history, what we've been through in time, either directly about our response to the threat violence depictions, or possibly, our response to other things that we are or aren't interested in, and how they connect to or contrast with that. And of course, the inevitable, slightly dull answer to is it nature or nurture is almost always a bit of both. Some people genuinely do seem to have a kind of like a nervous system reaction which responds more readily to signals redolent of threat. And some people seem to have nervous systems that are slightly less reactive to that. However, that is all then filtered through the experiences of a lifetime that ends up with one person looking keenly at the screen and the other one choosing to look away for a few moments.
What you're saying there makes me wonder about how much choice we have in all of this. We really do have to do an episode on free will at some point, because I just need to get it out of my system. But you might be born, so your biological inheritance might give you a slightly more reactive, I was going to say reactive reaction. It's probably not great English, is it?
Makes sense.
You're going to be a bit more reactive to that kind of stimulus. Or maybe it's something to do with previous events in your life and socialization. I'm reminded of that. I think it was Piaget who said that if you're trying to solve the nature-nurture debate, you may as well ask yourself, when trying to work out the area of a field, which is more important, the length or breadth?
Nice.
They're just equally important. And what we are is a combination of the interactions between your biology and your environment over time.
Yeah.
And so a stimulus is not just a stimulus, is it? It means different things to different people, because we all have different kind of biological inheritance and different learning histories. And the combination of all of those factors means that when a stimulus is presented to us, we are not going to respond in the same way to it.
Yeah. An initial sort of great tendency towards reacting with anxiety or startle to a sort of mild threat depiction or stimulus earlier in childhood may then of course differentiate what you choose to attend to. That might be part of a pathway that takes you into investing yourself in things that are mainly redolent of beauty, like music or art, whereas, folks like you and me are off watching sort of violent science fiction. And in the process of doing that, stepping up from very mild threat, did you prefer Scooby-Doo to Mary, Mungo and Midge, to give very old school sort of alternate childhood animations, then, you enjoyed that little bit of threat that was still a little bit scary at that age. And then, of course, what happens is that unless other awful and traumatic things happen to really change you, it may well be that sort of increases. And some would argue you slightly desensitize until you are sort of, when you step back and think about it, deriving entertainment, a depiction of somebody being horribly killed on screen, which arguably is the more surprising thing.
It's fascinating, this. It just feels so complicated, like too complicated to properly discuss in terms of the influences on what makes a stimulus function in the way it does for you. Because you talking about that put me in mind of watching Doctor Who as a kid. So I had the great fortune of being a kid in the 1970s when Doctor Who, I think, was just at its best, and it was that kind of regular fixture on a Saturday evening. It was family viewing. The cliche about Doctor Who is hiding behind the sofa, isn't it? So people of our generation, I think that phrase, hiding behind the sofa, gets associated with Doctor Who on a Saturday afternoon, because it was on at like 5:30 or something. If you watch some of those episodes now, some of them are horrific, way more scary than Doctor Who is nowadays.
Yeah.
And it was on at 5:30 on a Saturday afternoon. And so I think children were just watching it, and there were these horrific things going on the TV. And then there were the kids sort of wanting to watch it, but hiding behind the sofa because some of the stuff is pretty horrific. But I kind of enjoyed that. And I've heard people talking about horror, science fiction, why do kids like it? And it's because they can be scared in a safe environment. They can kind of learn how to be scared and know that nothing bad's going to happen. It's kind of like why we like roller coasters and that kind of thing, that it's frightening, but it's safe all at the same time. I guess there's this issue of some people like roller coasters, some people don't. I've gone on from, I guess, watching and being fascinated by this somewhat horrific and scary television program as a child. I quite like edgy, darker drama. But you're right, like there was no way I'd want to see that in real life. Or be part of that. I don't want to be, kidnapped by aliens, and so seeing those kinds of things. Or I'm abhorred by violence in real life, and yet I find it somewhat enticing in a drama if it's not gratuitous, but if it's part of a narrative and it makes sense to me, then I don't mind watching it. But there is that thing then, though, of like, why am I like that, and why is someone else not like that? What are the influences to make watching a gritty drama somewhat appetitive for me? Like I have a kind of appetite for it, whereas it's going to be quite aversive for somebody else. That feels really complex to figure out.
Yeah. And I think for me, that comes back to one of the things that's a kind of like a guiding principle of the forms of psychological therapy you and I are both involved with, which, and it's very easy for people not to be aware of this, but that have as an absolute founding principle that we're not actually trying to work out what's the truth. Well, for various reasons, one of which is the truth is just too enormous and too complicated to know all of how anything works. What we're actually trying to do is be useful. We're trying to sort of focus in enough and find some plausible and usable causal strands or sets of, this seems to be influencing this, and this seems to be influencing this, brackets alongside a million other things we can't keep track of. And maybe if this bit can change, then that bit can change. So talking about, the ABC that you were talking about, and we should flag up, other ABCs are available. There are ones that derive directly from behaviour therapies, where the A is traditionally stood for antecedent, the B is traditionally stood for behaviour, the C is stood for consequences. But whichever of those things that we're looking at, the idea that, some things actually are just an A, and some things are just a B, and some things are just a C, actually doesn't really hold up, because everything's kind of everything looked at in a certain way. So rather than seeing this single like track of, here's the initial activating event, say, and here's the belief, and here's the consequence, cleanly and definedly and exclusively, actually, when we get into it, it doesn't quite work like that, does it? Because sometimes, the belief is kind of like an activating event to something else. And sometimes the consequence becomes the activating event to another belief. And similarly, if we're talking about antecedents and behaviors and consequences. So it's not that these things are intrinsically A's or B's or C's. It's that we, like a director framing her hands as a picture frame, is looking at this big, complex world and choosing to say, okay, I'm going to look at this, how this bit relates to this bit relates to this bit. And we're just going to focus in on that. Why? Not because that tells us the truth of how everything is, but it just might help us because we have a reason to think that this consequence is causing a person suffering. So let's just see what the kind of proximate and the nearest and the most manageable likely influences on that are, even though we have to say back and say, and there's a million things we could never possibly be tracking on this. Because if we waited to understand how everything worked, we could never help ourselves and we could never help anybody else.
Humans are messy. That was a line that was used in this event that I was at last night. That they were talking about mind parasites again, and there's some kind of parasitic thing that can invade the minds of humans and get treatment. But if this has happened to you, you've had this parasite, it's a risk factor for later diagnosis of schizophrenia. And so this guy who was the mind parasite expert, he said that he had a letter once from a woman who said, look, I had this parasite, got treatment, but I did later, got diagnosed with schizophrenia, and I've had a series of failed marriages and my kids have been in care. Like, is that me or is it the parasite? Which is a great question, to which there is no answer, right? It's just, there's the expert in the parasite saying, well, we just don't know. Humans are too messy to figure all of this stuff out.
Yeah.
By way of trying to simplify this, it feels like when we're thinking about stuff, there are sort of two types, or no, maybe that's not correct. But if I lay out what I'm thinking, and you can respond, there are non-arbitrary stimuli. So things that are, inverted commas don't work very well on a podcast, but I'm doing that inverted commas thing with my fingers. Things that are, quote, real. So as I look out now, I can see a microphone, I can see a laptop, I can see a mug of tea. I think most people would agree those things are real, right? They sort of exist. They have ontological status. They have thinghood. They are there in the environment. And then there are the arbitrary properties of those things. So, for example, this microphone I'm speaking into isn't one of these newfangled podcast microphones. It's the vocal mic that I bought years ago when I was in a band and we did a lot of recording. And I'm very attached to it. It has a sort of place in my heart, which if you looked at it, you would have none of that. So it's more sort of grabby. My attention sticks to it in a way that yours wouldn't. So I've kind of imbued it with arbitrary characteristics because I have a history with it. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, absolutely. Those are not visible and they're not like intrinsic to the physical form, the physical reality of that thing, because they're not here now, are they? Your memory of it is here, your attachment to it is here. But it on a shonky stand in a pub somewhere, playing the best gig you ever played is not here now. And it's not a property of the thing right here, right now.
There is some evidence from psychological research that people attend more to things that they've acquired. So if something is a possession, it will grab your attention much more than if it isn't. So I will attend more to my things than your things. And there's also evidence that has some cultural variations. So I believe it was Nigeria they were talking about in this thing I was listening to around this whole kind of acquisition bias, that in Nigeria, if things have been gifted to you, they hold a much kind of higher status and therefore they grab your attention much more than if you'd acquired it in some other way. The other thing it reminds me of is that I'm not a big kind of Harry Potter fan because I feel like I'm the generation before that was into Star Wars. I believe there's some kind of line in there that where Dumbledore says something to Harry about just because it's in your head, Harry, doesn't mean it's not real.
Yeah.
But we're sort of getting into this notion that there are not two types of stuff, but one type of stuff with two different sets of properties. There's the kind of non-arbitrary, finger quotes, real properties. And then there are the arbitrary properties that we kind of wrap around something because of our relationship to it.
That's where the huge variation comes in, isn't it? Because some of the non-arbitrary properties of a thing to observers, they would still be subtly different. It depends where you're standing, what the light's like, all that kind of stuff. You might ascribe slightly different properties to the thingness of that microphone. But it's going to be broadly the same for the non-arbitrary properties of it. But absolutely, the arbitrary properties will be this massively complex set of history and relationships that we have.
What's that little cake routine you do in training?
This is about that sort of arbitrary things and how behaviour is sometimes pushed around, not by the thing, but by other stuff that's associated with the things. Okay, now there's a massive stream of very abstract words. So let me just make it a little bit more concrete for you. So if I were to say to you, if you walk through that door right now, I will give you a financier. I'm going to make the assumption that you don't know what a financier is. Do you not know what a financier is?
I don't know.
Well, that works well for me then. Okay, so you don't know what a financier is. So me offering to give you a financier if you walk through that door, that's kind of a fairly neutral thing. You're not quite sure whether you want to walk through that door or not now. So I'm not actually going to tell you what happens when you walk through that door now. I'm just going to give you a piece of information that a financier is actually a heavy fine. You know, kind of comes from the French. So a financier is a heavy fine. Do you want to walk through the door?
No, thank you.
Why is that?
Because money, without making myself sound really greedy, but money has appetitive functions for me. I kind of like it, and I don't particularly want to give it away for no good reason. So if I'd be fine for just walking through a door, I'm not up for that. Thanks.
Okay, this is such a natural thing that we humans do that you haven't even noticed it, and most people wouldn't even noticed it. But I never said you will get fined when you walk through the door. I said you will get a financier if you walk through the door. Point one. Point two, a financier is a fine. And you derived the third bit, which is, therefore, if I walk through the door, I get a fine. So you did that so automatically you didn't even notice you were doing it, because that's one of these brilliant things that humans can do with language. Isn't it cool? Now let me give you another piece of information. A financier is actually a rather delicious cake. It's a little French, tasty little, quite plain, but very tasty cake. Now, depending on your hunger status or whatever, are you more likely to walk through the door than you were 2 minutes ago?
I'm slightly dubious as to whether it's got lactose in it.
It's a definitely unlactosed financier in this particular case.
Lactose-free financier.
Lactose-free, alcohol-free, everything.
Okay, cool. Yeah, then I'm up for it. Yeah, give me the cake. Give me the cake.
Okay, give me the cake. Give me the cake. And remember, I never said I would give you a cake. What I said was, go through the door, you get a financier. Financier is a cake. So again, you did that. You derived it accurately, automatically, so smoothly. So this word, this label, and remember, we humans, we communicate and we cooperate on the basis of labels. I mean, I'm to constantly show each other stuff. We just use the verbal labels for them so well. What actually happened there was your behavior changed, not on the basis of me telling you directly what the consequence of walking through the door was, but by changing your understanding of what the verbal label financier is. So I changed the relationship between that word and other concepts that you're very familiar with. And then you pulled that back to, therefore, is it something I want to move towards or away? Therefore, do I want to walk through the door or not? Even though that same sound, financier, was true in both cases.
That is fascinating. It seems to me then that the world that we live in as like adult humans in particular is governed largely by arbitrary relations. Like it's governed by the arbitrary properties of things. When I've done training, I've used cakes as an example of this. So I've got 2 slides of different cakes. They're the same cake pretty much. And I often describe like, here's a delicious Victoria sponge. And I ask people to imagine, taking a slice of that and putting that in your mouth, and the slightly dry texture of the sponge mixed with the wet cream and the jam and the sweetness of that. And by the time I've elaborated on this, people are salivating. And then I switched the slides to exactly the same cake, but whereas the first cake had "Happy Birthday" written on the top of it in icing, the second cake has got "Find the Toenail" written on it in icing. And you just see the revulsion on people's faces. But it's fascinating that just the arrangement of the icing on the second cake produces this visceral physiological disgust response. That's completely arbitrary, right? If you showed that same picture to someone who couldn't read English, it wouldn't have the same response. Some of this stuff, when you really get into it, it's a little bit disturbing, isn't it? Because there are a lot of the ways in which society functions. So we talked about money earlier. Let me ask you, like, if I had a crisp £20 note And I said,
Mhm.
look, here is this stimulus. Would you like it?
Yes, I would like that.
You would like that. Because,
Well, because I know I can exchange that token for other things that I might directly enjoy. For food or showing my age again, a DVD or something.
so it's just a bit of paper, right? Really.
Mm.
And we, as a society, have kind of imbued it with characteristics, and we've all sort of agreed that it's worth something and you can exchange it for goods and services, etc. If you took it to, your favorite DVD stockist and they said, no, we don't want that. We don't take those. And so you thought, oh, it's disappointing. I'll take it to the cake shop, and they
Mm.
didn't want it either. And you tried to spend it elsewhere, and nobody wanted it. Which, as has happened in some countries, right? That overnight,
Absolutely. Yeah.
some bits of currency just get deleted or devalued. If you could no longer exchange it for goods and services, would you still want it?
No, I can't see another practical use, particularly the stuff we make notes out of now. You couldn't even start a fire with it.
So you only want it because other people want it. It's this strange thing that people sometimes refer to as intersubjective reality.
Oh.
It's this kind of reality that only really exists subjectively in this kind of shared way. If something suddenly is not wanted by other people, then you don't want it either. So we can change the way the stimulus functions just by our attitude toward it, or the things we say about it. So once we start evaluating something as being good or bad, we can kind of make people want it more or less. Another example. So unlike my good self, who cannot take the alcohol because of a kidney problem, you don't mind a drink, right? You know what I'm
I
talking
do
about.
not. That's true.
And what would be your favoured tipple if we were to go to the pub?
Okay, if we're in the pub, I would enjoy a nice pint of bitter.
And is there something you really wouldn't want, like you just would never order? No, there's
Um,
nothing.
sorry, this could be a really bad example. There are certain sort of cocktails and things that just have tastes in that I find unpleasant.
Okay. So we've got a pint of bitter and some fancy cocktail. Right. So
Yeah.
here's some scenarios, right? So number one, hi Ray, I've just been to the bar because I knew you were coming. I couldn't for the life of me remember what you drunk. So I got a pint of bitter and a fancy cocktail. Which one would you like?
I'll have the pint of bitter, please, Rich.
Right. That's obvious, right? So 'cause you've got a learning history that says, I like bitter,
Yeah.
I don't like cocktails, so you want the bitter. Okay, scenario number two. Hi, Ray. I've just been to the bar. I got you a pint of bitter because I know it's your favourite. And as I was paying for it, there was a guy stood there and I don't know what he was up to, but he got this like silver wrapper out of his pocket and emptied some kind of powder into it. I mean, it sort of looks all right, but I wasn't sure whether you'd be cool with that. So I did ask for another bitter, but the barrel was out. They didn't have any. The only drink they had available was this fancy cocktail. Which one would you like?
Okay, I'm going for the cocktail now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Scenario number three. Hi, Ray. I got you a bitter, and now, let me tell you, I've been speaking to a lot of people about alcohol as a sort of vicarious way of trying to enjoy it because I can't drink it myself. And I've been told about this cocktail. I've been told about this independent distillery in Dudley where they've been slaving away to make the best alcoholic ingredients possible. And they've come up with this incredible cocktail. And like everyone is talking about it. Everyone is saying, this is the thing, right? You've just got to try it. And I know like cocktails aren't really your thing. And, given that I love and care for you as much as I do, I thought I just could not pass up the opportunity to just give Ray the option, at least, of trying this amazing thing. Which one
Right.
would you like?
I would probably then say, yeah, let's have a go at this cocktail.
Okay. So, I mean, what I've done there, right? The two stimuli are exactly the same. There's a pint of bitter and there's a fancy cocktail in all three scenarios, and I've just wrapped some arbitrary stuff around it. What I've managed to do is change the balance between appetitive and aversive functions of the two different drinks. So you probably like the bitter. The bitter doesn't really change except for scenario two where you didn't want it because I told you someone had poisoned it. like, that's amazing, right? Just the ability to
Mm.
be able to manipulate your response by making some sounds with my face.
It is amazing, isn't it? Because, presumably it comes from us. You've used the word appetitive, things that we like, wanting to move towards our ancestors, moving towards a good source of food and move away from, a scary wolf, and those are kind of fairly non-arbitrary things. And yeah, as you say, yeah, in this situation, suddenly it's all these other things around it. It's not simply that you saying what's the content of your head changes what's the content of my head. It actually changes which way my hand goes out and which liquid I then ingest. A real kind of hard behavioural outcome.
Okay, so I feel like we've had a very abstract conversation today in many ways. I wonder if we could try and make this a little more kind of concrete. What would be something that, listeners might usefully take away, bearing in mind that human behaviour is governed in many ways by these completely arbitrary properties of stuff. So it's not the thing itself, but it's the meanings we attach to it and the language that gets wrapped around stimuli. There's a huge amount of that that's governing people's behavior. How do we help people navigate the world accepting that that's part of the reality of it?
Doing that within a minute in a podcast is a challenge. And I think there are still, even then, sort of small things that we can do that can make a difference. So much of this, how we relate things, how the arbitrary stuff around things influence our choice and behavior towards them, happens without our awareness and happens without our noticing and happens all the time. So we can't change how we do that all the time, I think, without just grinding to a complete halt. However, when we're in situations where there's a difficult choice, or we're in a situation that we're aware we quite often end up getting ourselves into trouble, possibly the single simplest thing we can do is to try and come off sort of the autopilot, the sort of habitual way of reacting to all of these things if it hasn't worked out for us, or if we're striking out into new territory that we're not sure about. And the key way I think of doing that is actually pausing, is noticing, okay, so where am I? What am I reacting to here? What actually are my choices for going forward? It might not be easy, might not be a single simple answer, but rather than just going in the situation, moving forward. This is not a particularly radical stance. Again, it's one of those things that every culture, every set of people who try to think about this have come up with versions of the same thing. One of the ones that I and I suspect you, one kind of quotation that often sums this up, is one that's attributed widely to a very influential thinker, writer, psychiatrist called Viktor Frankl from the middle of the last century, who said, between stimulus and response, there's a gap. And in that gap lies our power to choose, and in that choice lies our freedom. Now, a little bracket to put around that. Turns out lots of people think Frankl said it. Frankl didn't say it. Somebody else once read a book, saw that phrase, thought, oh, that's exactly what Viktor Frankl was talking about. And in a book about Frankl, sort of attributed to him, there's a writer called Stephen Covey. So you'll often see that quote attributed to Viktor Frankl. But actually that idea of we can stop and we can notice, what are we reacting to here? What are my choices in front of me? That doesn't necessarily tell us the right thing, but it stops us being as pushed around automatically by stuff that we wouldn't choose to be.
I think what you're saying there, and again, this is pressing my free will buttons, and we'll probably come back to this if we ever get around to doing that episode, which we'll either do or we don't do, right? We've got no choice in the matter. But is that certainly what we can say, like I'm not entirely sure about whether we have free will or not, but what we can say is we cannot choose the stuff in our environment. We certainly cannot choose initial response we have to it, because that's based on a whole bunch of combination of biology and environmental influences over a lifetime. So if you have a reaction to something, you can't choose that reaction, right? Like your partner can't decide to not find that violent scene aversive. She just does. And maybe we do have some power to choose how we respond to that reaction. So we can sort of pause and think what's going on, what am I feeling? What am I thinking? Where might that be coming from? Sort of slow down and tune in and then choose a response. I think that's what you're saying.
Yeah, absolutely. It just opens up more options. And it says, even if we can't change the environment and we can't change our learning history, which we can't because it's history, we don't have to be completely dominated by it. We can still choose to move towards something. It's like my partner could have said, actually, I'd rather not come to this film. Or a person might have said, I think it'd be really good for me to really, really force myself to watch every grisly moment of it. Or to say, I'm going to watch the film, I'm going to enjoy the film, I'm going to look away in the grisly bits. There's the choice.
Okay. I think that's a nice moment to conclude on, although not entirely the end of the podcast, because I need to ask you a question.
Oh, you certainly do.
Let's go and ask Ray, shall we?
So I feel like this kind of fits in with the topic of today because it is a bit about evaluation. So the question is, what is the worst food of all time? A food product, might be natural or invented, that you just think like, that is the devil's work. I am not letting a morsel of that ever pass my lips.
I'm really shocked at myself that I can't think of one. I have eaten some truly terrible things.
You glutton.
Well, yes, exactly. Yeah, gourmand, not a gourmet. And funnily enough, I was thinking about this when you were offering me the two drinks, and particularly gave me the big pitch about the new cocktail. One of my kind of core values is curiosity. So I'm one of those people in a restaurant who I can see one of my favourite dishes on the menu, but if there's something I've never tried before, I will go for that. So I will try to do things. I did. There are, I grew up in a community where we eat meat, and including you eat offal, internal organs, because it's cheap and all that kind of stuff. Okay, I have never and will never eat brain knowingly. But people do. People have brains on toast. But no, I've got enough.
I really was not expecting you to say that.
What were you expecting? Cheese or beans or
burgers or kebabs or something? Brain. Wow. Well, that's put anything I might have said in the shade. I was going to say prawns, but that's a massive anticlimax now, isn't it? So what anticlimax after brains? Right, well.
Okay, more conventionally, I would say cuttlefish, because I really like cuttlefish as creatures. I'm really interested in them, and I wouldn't want to kill and eat one. So there's a conventional answer. And true.
Now that is interesting, isn't it? Because that takes us right back to this whole thing about the sort of arbitrary, non-arbitrary. Like cuttlefish might be delicious, and the meaning that you attach to them means that you're just not ever going to try and find out. Okay, well, thank you. That was a very interesting discussion. I enjoyed it immensely. So thank you very much for your time as always, Ray. See you again.
See you soon.